GANTHONY'S WIFE by E. Temple Thurston. The custom of telling stories round the fire on Christmas Eve is dying out, like letter writing and all the amateur domestic arts of the last century. Our stories are told us by professionals and broadcast to thousands by the printing machine. We give our letters to a dictaphone or a stenographer. The personal touch is going out of life, if it has not already gone. In an age where every conceivable machine is invented to save time and labour, we have no time to spare for these things. We are too exhausted from working our machines to give them our attention. We were saying all this last year as we sat round a blazing wood fire at that little house party the Stennings give every Christmas in that Tudor house of theirs on the borders of Kent and Sussex. The children had gone to bed. There were 5 of us grown-ups left round the broad open fireplace, where huge oak logs were burning on the glowing heart of a pile of silver ashes that had been red hot for a week or more. Miss Valerie Brett, the actress, was sitting inside the chimney corner, warming first one toe, then the other. She comes there every Christmas. Well, the children love her. She can make funny noises with her mouth. Also, by facial contortion, she can look like Queen Victoria on the heads of all the pennies that ever were minted. In a semicircle outside we sat, the rest of us, Stennings and his wife, Northanger, and myself, smoking our various smokes and sipping that punch, the secret of which Stennings learnt from an old wine merchant in Winthrop Street, Cork. I think he relies on it to secure the few select guests he always has at his Christmas parties. Come down for Christmas. Punch. This is a common form of his invitation. We had been playing games with the children, hide and seek being the most popular. We were all a bit exhausted. It was Mrs. Stennings who opened the discussion by complaining that there was no one qualified to tell children ghost stories nowadays. We had a man here last Christmas, she said, and he began one, but the children guessed the end of it before it was halfway through. Bless 'em, said Miss Brett. Yeah, it was a rotten story anyhow, said Stennings. We can't make a mystery now by just rattling a chain and slamming a door and blowing out the candle. When the candle went out, young John said, "Why didn't he shut the window?" Our amiable storyteller assured John that he did, but he wasn't convincing about it because Emily said, "'Spect it was like that window up in my bedroom. The wind comes through there when it's shut and blows the curtains about." Mrs. Stennings sighed. "I suppose they know too much," she said, "and all I've done, you don't know, to try and keep them simple." "They don't know too much," said Northanger. "It's more likely we who know too little. We don't believe in the rattling chain and the extinguished candle ourselves. We've been laughing at them for the last 20 years, and they've caught up with us." "Do you mean this civilization's at the end of its evolution?" I asked. "Either that," said he, "or we're in one of those hanging pauses, like a switchback when it gets to the top of a crest and just crawls over the top till it gathers a fresh impetus to rise to a higher crest. It's only pessimists who say we're finished. Shedding an old skin is a proper process of nature. There are signs of the old skin going." Northanger is a queer chap. He talks very little. This was voluble for him, as usually happens with a man like that. We listened. "What signs?" asked Miss Brett. "All sorts," said he. "There's even a new ghost. I saw one last Christmas." You saw one? 2 or 3 of us spoke at once. "I saw one," he repeated. If a man like Northanger admits to seeing a ghost, we felt there must be something in it. It would not be a mere turnip head with a candle inside. "Why didn't you tell us when the children were here?" asked Mrs. Stennings immediately. "It's not a story for children," he replied, "though I don't know why it shouldn't be. They wouldn't understand it, and that's the first quality required of a ghost story. Tell us." This was practically simultaneous from everybody. Miss Brett pulled her feet up onto the chimney corner seat. Stennings slipped over to the table and brought round the punch bowl to fill our glasses. I say slipped over because he moved like a man who does not want to disturb an atmosphere. Somehow that chap Northanger had put a grip on us. We felt he knew that what he was going to tell us was unknowable. He had indeed created an atmosphere, the atmosphere that Stennings was careful not to disturb. There was the proper sort of hush in the air while he was filling our glasses. No one had lit the lights since we had been playing at hide-and-seek. We were all grouped around the light of the fire. Then Northanger began. "Do any of you know Ganthony? Ganthony's a tea planter in Ceylon." None of us did. "Well, that makes it better," said he. Then he looked across at Miss Brett. "You and I haven't met before, Miss Brett," he said, "till our good friends brought us together this Christmas. I've seen you on the stage, but not being one of those admirers who have the courage to offer their congratulations without introduction, you haven't seen me till now." In that prelude, I suddenly had a glimpse of Northanger's way with women. An odd, sardonic sort of way. Too subtle for most of them, but conveying with it an impression that he was not unsusceptible. She smiled as he continued. "In case our good friends haven't told you then," he went on, "it's necessary to say I'm a bachelor. I have rooms in Stretton Street, Piccadilly. I've been there 17 years. When they pull down Devonshire House, they pull me off my perch. That'll be the end of Stretton Street. I don't mean my going, but without the restraining influence of the Baroness Burdett Coutts and the Duke of Devonshire, Stretton Street will become anybody's street. A cinema theatre in those new buildings they are going to put up on the site of Devonshire House will send Stretton Street to the dogs. It's like that with people. 90% of us live by example. However, my story's about Ganthony. It was last Christmas, 1923. I was staying in town. I often do. I like London on Christmas Day." Miss Brett shuddered. "Yes, I know," said Northanger. "London seems dead to lots of people when the shops are shut and the theatres are closed. It doesn't get me like that. It seems alive to me." "What with?" It was Mrs. Stennings who asked this. "With the spirits of people. We were talking about ghosts. Well, how could you expect a ghost to clank a chain when the rattle of motor buses would drown the noise of it out of existence? What's the good of blowing out candles when the streets are daylight with night signs? There's one thing I always do when I'm in London on Christmas Day. I go to my club. It used to be one of the old gaming houses before the Regency. Modern interior decoration has hidden all that, but on Christmas Day, when some of the rooms are absolutely empty, they come back, the old gamesters. You can feel them about you. Imagination, I know, but who has properly defined what imagination is? Memory's impulse of association isn't good enough. Where does the impulse come from? I always go to my club. I went there that afternoon and, to my amazement, found Ganthony in the smoking room, writing letters. Ganthony is one of those men who belong to a London club and appear in it, somewhat like a comet, at rare intervals. Suddenly he walks in, gets his letters from the hall porter, fills a waste paper basket with the accumulated rubbish, and writes a pile of answers. Well, for the next week or so you can find him practically at any moment on the premises. Then one day you say to the hall porter, "Mr. Ganthony in the club?" "Mr. Ganthony, sir?" He's gone. Perhaps as much as 3 years go by before you see him again. That Christmas Day, I hadn't seen him for 4 years at least. He was surrounded with letters and was writing for all he was worth. I think he was as glad to see me as I was to see him. He'd just come home from Ceylon. Didn't know how long he was going to stay. He never does. I picked out a comfortable chair, then we talked. Presently I inquired about his wife, whether he'd brought her with him, how she was. His eyes went like pebbles when the waters dried off them. My wife died nearly a year ago, said he. I must tell you about Ganthony's wife. He had met and married her during the war, but the war had nothing to do with it. We've got into the habit of putting these hurried marriages down to the war. Whenever they'd met, Ganthony would have married her. It was the case of a man meeting the fate that was in store for him and rushing to it like a bit of steel to a magnet. What he had meant to her, I've never been able to quite satisfy my mind about. The relationships that circumstance contrives between individuals must have some sort of scheme about them, but I'm blowed if it's possible to begin to think what it is, or how it's regulated. Ganthony met her in a restaurant. He'd just come out of hospital, been knocked out by a shell burst on Vimy Ridge. His face had been cut about and was still all wrapped in bandages. One side of his face was fairly clear. On the other, his eye just peeped out of a mass of lint. He didn't care what he looked like. In fact, I think it rather amused him to go and dine in public. He went alone. She was dining at a table a few yards away with a man. Like everyone else, she was attracted by the sight of this bandaged face of Ganthony's. She drew her companion's attention. I had all this from Ganthony himself just before he was married. It was as though she said, "They've been knocking him about, haven't they?" The man looked at him for a moment or two. Wounded men were pretty common those days. He was a soldier himself. He was in khaki. He took no more notice. But the woman went on looking. Every other second, Ganthony caught her eye. More than that, he could see she didn't want her companion to notice it. Something about it intrigued Ganthony. The scheme, whatever it is, was beginning to work. The fate was beginning to draw him. He smiled, so far as that was possible with half his face in bandages. She smiled in return. One of those smiles a woman can hide from everyone, but the person for whom it is intended. In a few minutes they were talking to each other with their eyes. That sort of conversation that isn't hampered with the expression and meaning of mere words. Ganthony cut a course out and finished his meal before they did. He ordered his bill when she was looking at him. He paid it, looked at the door, then at her, then he got up and went out. He hadn't to wait more than 2 seconds before she was outside on the pavement beside him. She'd made some excuse to her companion. She had, for decency's sake, to go back and finish her dinner. They arranged to meet later. They were married in a week. No need to tell you more than that. You can put it down to the war if you like. But Ganthony wasn't the sort of man to marry that sort of woman just because there was a war on. He did it with his eyes open, even if his face was bandaged. He knew the kind she was. He knew he wasn't the first. But I suppose he may have thought that when he took her out to Ceylon, after he was quit of the war, he would be the last. I never thought so, but it was no good telling him that. When a man runs into fate as he did, platitudes and speculations about morals don't stop him. He has to find things out for himself. God disposes sometimes, it seems to me, before and after a man's proposal. Anyhow, that's as much as it has to do with this story. Ganthony had married. Now his wife was dead. I confessed to a feeling of satisfaction when I heard it. She was a beautiful woman, no doubt, intensely attractive. I had never seen her, but he had sent me a snapshot of himself and her from Ceylon after they got out there. However, attraction isn't everything. It invites, but it doesn't always entertain. "It doesn't sound very much like a ghost story," said Mrs. Stennings. Northanger apologized. "I warned you it wasn't a ghost story for children," said he. "I told you they wouldn't understand it. I doubt if I understand it myself." "Shove a log on, Valerie," said Stennings. "And don't interrupt him, Grace. The man's earning his punch, with me anyhow. Go on, Northanger. You tell it your own way. Women always want to see the last page. Ganthony's wife was dead." "Yes, dead," Northanger went on. "Ganthony saw her dead. They had lived in Colombo for the first 6 or 8 months, and apparently, in that short time, he came to know how attractive she was. And yet it was not only her physical attraction for men, he told me, as a sort of fatality about her that drew them as it had drawn him. Apparently he knew nothing, in fact. She was not so much secretive about it as almost mysterious. As far as I can make out, it was as though she had a vocation for that sort of life, like the sacred women in the temple of Osiris at Thebes. I can imagine her having been extraordinarily mysterious with that other man in the restaurant when she first met Ganthony. She must have just slipped away from him when that dinner was over. At one moment he may have thought she was his for the evening, the next she was gone. It was the beginning of that feeling in Ganthony that at any moment he might lose her, made him leave Colombo and take her up country to a spot close to his plantations. She made no complaint. It was not as though she were a gay woman and were being torn away from her gaiety. She went without a word. He was terribly fond of her. Any fool could have seen that. Notwithstanding the way he had met her, it had not continued to be promiscuous with him. She was a sacred woman to him, right enough. He told me about her death, in that slow, measured sort of way as a man walks at the end of a journey. Whatever she'd been, her death had left a wound in his life that wouldn't heal in a hurry. Are we to hear how she did die?" I asked. "Yes, I want to hear how she died," said Miss Brett. "I'm coming to that," said Northanger. Away there up country, Ganthony felt she was safe. Except down at the plantations, there were no Englishmen about. After a few months up there, when she seemed to be quite contented, Ganthony had to go down to Colombo on business. He was gone 3 days. When he came back, she was gone. The native servants were in a panic. He scoured the country for 2 days. They'd heard nothing of her down at the plantations. She'd vanished, slipped away. On the 3rd day, coming back after a fruitless search, he found a Buddhist priest waiting for him at his bungalow. All the man would say was, "I've come to bring you to see the Memsahib." Ganthony followed him. Again and again he asked the fellow what was the matter, threatened him, tried to frighten him, but he'd say nothing except, "You shall see the Memsahib." On the side of a hill about 3 miles from Ganthony's bungalow, there was a Buddhist monastery. He was taken there, and there on a rough sort of bed in one of the rooms, it was a rest place, he found his wife, lying, dead. There was no question of getting a doctor. There was not a doctor within miles. I asked him if he was sure she was dead, and he turned those stone eyes of his on me. "You have to be your own doctor out there," said he, "and there are 1 or 2 things you can't fail to recognize. Death's one of them." She'd been dead some time. She was quite cold. There's no mistaking when the spirit's gone out of the body. Hers was gone. I could feel it had. She lay there, just a dead body, and I felt I couldn't touch her then. It seemed repulsive without her spirit. I asked him how she got there, what he thought she'd died of, how long he imagined she'd been dead. None of his answers were very elaborate. He made it out to be fever. She had walked by herself into the monastery. She must have been dead 2 days. He arrived at that decision apart from what the monks told him. Then, he said, an extraordinary thing, which made me realize the repulsion he had felt for that body bereft of its spirit. I left her there, he said. They buried her. Well, that was Ganthony's story, as he told it me that Christmas afternoon in the club. We had tea together while we talked. After that, he went back to finish his letters, and I went into the reading room till about 7:15. Oh, it was snowing then, coming down like a white fog over the black darkness outside. There was hardly a taxi moving in the streets. I'd ordered my dinner for 8 o'clock at my rooms. I went out of the reading room to make a move towards Stretton Street, and then I thought of Ganthony, probably dining there in the club by himself. I looked into the smoking room and asked him to come along. He pushed his hand through his bundle of letters. "Only half finished," said he. "Finish 'em tomorrow." "No," he said. "I'll get 'em done now while I'm at it. If I get finished before 10, I'll look in and have a drink with you. But no more raising from the dead. That's buried." I nodded my head. It was plain he wasn't coming. When a man wants to do a thing, he does it without ifs and buts. Those are feminine prerogatives. I left him to his letters. I walked out of the club, pushed my way through that white storm across the black gape of Trafalgar Square, up the Haymarket, and turned off into Jermyn Street. I always think Jermyn Street is a queer street. I've known odd men living there, in little rooms over little shops. It keeps an atmosphere about it which the rest of London is losing as fast as a woman loses self-respect directly she takes a drink. It has dark, sunken doorways. The houses are so close together that you hardly ever look up at the windows as you pass along its narrow thoroughfare. I never used to think of the existence of those windows till an odd chap I knew invited me to his rooms there. There was something so queer about them that after that I spent a morning walking along the north side of Jermyn Street, looking up at the houses on the opposite side. They're nearly all of them funny. They're hiding places, and the street itself has got that feeling. So much has it got it, that it is one of the favourite walking places of that band of sisters who count the world well lost for, well, why shouldn't they call it love? I never expected to see one of them that night. There wasn't a soul anywhere. The snow was coming down like a muslin curtain of a big design. A policeman passed me. His footsteps and mine were silent in the snow. I wished him a happy Christmas as I went by. His answer was like the voice of a man with a respirator on. The snow had dressed him in white. He just appeared and disappeared. I was getting near the St. James's End, just about where old Cox's hotel used to stand, when through the muslin curtain of snow, just as through the curtains you can dimly see someone moving about inside a room, I saw a figure coming towards me. I felt a moment's surprise. It was a woman. There were not many steps for us to approach each other before we met. With that snow, the whole of London was cramped up into the dimensions of a narrow little room. As we passed, it was just as though she had pulled the curtains for an instant and looked through the window at me. Then, like the policeman, she was gone. It might have been the instinct of a raconteur to heighten the suspense, but here Northanger stopped and looked at Valerie Brett. "Go on," we said. "Well," said he, "I'm considering this young lady's feeling. To give you the proper impression of what happened, I have to be what the novelists call psychological here. Will she mind?" "Don't be an ass," said Stennings. "You know jolly well you're only trying to tantalise us. Go on with your psychology. She's on the stage. They're full of psychology there." "I only felt it necessary," said Northanger, "to describe a man's attitude towards encounters like this. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say my own towards this particular one, because though as far as the story is she'd gone by, there had been that half-instant's pause, the moment, as I said, when she seemed to have pulled the muslin curtains and looked at me out of the window. That pause was indescribable. It was an encounter. Most often a woman like that says something, a fatuous word of endearment, a challenge, a salute as if you were old friends. Well, this woman didn't say anything. She just looked through that pause at me, and though I could not have described her for the life of me, I felt clearly conscious of her personality. I don't know what a woman feels like about her own sex of that class. I expect most men would have felt what I did then, a sort of demand for consideration, quite unsupported by the conscience or moral standards of a county councillor. Christmas Day, and that snowstorm when most people were sitting beside a warm fire, awaiting the announcement of a comfortable meal, I felt pretty sorry for her. I suppose it was this, and that consciousness of her personality, made me turn. If she had said anything, I should have walked straight on. She had gone by in silence, and I turned. She had not only turned as well. She had stopped. With all that snow on the ground, I hadn't heard her. We stood there looking at each other, and then she came back. "Going to your club?" she said. "Coming from it," said I. "Going home, I suppose?" I nodded my head. "And all the family expecting you back to dinner?" I told her there was no family, merely dinner. "Alone?" she asked. "Quite alone," said I. That didn't deter her. She started walking in my direction. I should have looked a fool if I had refused to accompany her. Besides that, there's a considerable excitement of interest in talking to an absolute stranger of the other sex. Men, and women too, would indulge more frequently in that kind of adventure if they weren't so afraid of appearances. Probably the snowstorm gave me courage. We walked into St. James's Street together, and up into Piccadilly. "I live just in Stretton Street," said I. "If you come much farther, a mere common politeness will compel me to ask you in to dinner." "If you did," said she, "a mere common appetite for a comfortable meal would compel me to accept." The human voice is an extraordinary thing. It is an unfailing indication of character and personality. You can't really fake it. The best actor or actress in the world, he made a sweep of his hand excluding Valerie Brett, can only make up their face, and they can't make up their voice. They can imitate, but that's not the same thing. There was something in this woman's voice that guaranteed me against feeling ashamed of myself before my man Charles. Well, Charles is essentially a diplomat, but he has taste. How she was dressed didn't matter so much. How was she dressed? I couldn't see, covered as she was with the snow that was falling. I don't know anything about women's dress, but I was conscious of the impression that she was what a man calls all right. "Allow me to invite you, then," said I, and when she accepted, I felt I had done a thing which you do, not so much because you want to, as because of some arrangement of things which needs a certain act from you at a certain given moment. I felt that Ganthony's refusal to come and dine with me was an essential part of that whole arrangement. I felt that my will was not concerned in the matter. I walked up the steps and opened the door with my latchkey, and it seemed as though it were a mere act of obedience on my part. When she passed me into the hall, it was as though she had control of the situation, not I. I am trying to convey my impressions to you in the light of what happened, yet I don't want to exaggerate those impressions because Up to the last moment, there was no reason why it should not have appeared absolutely natural. A little unconventional, perhaps, but that's all. I have only 4 rooms at Stretton Street, a dining room, a sitting room, and 2 bedrooms. Charles showed her along to the spare bedroom to take her coat off and tidy up. It was 10 minutes off dinner, and here is another impression I'm sure I don't exaggerate. Charles's manner, from the moment he saw her, was by no means that of the incomparable diplomat. It was not that he objected her coming to a meal in the flat so much as that he would have avoided the situation if he could. When I taxed him with it afterwards, he said, "I make my apologies, sir, if I showed anything." "You disapproved, Charles?" I asked him. "No, sir. Why should I disapprove?" "Then what was it?" "I just felt awkward, sir. I felt as though the lady knew more about things than what I did, which is an uncomfortable feeling, sir, when it's a woman." Well, that's that. Charles has no reason to exaggerate his impressions, because I've never told him anything. Anyhow, we don't matter. She's the centre of the tale. She came into the sitting room in about 5 minutes with her coat and hat off. I suppose she was well dressed. I can only tell you there was nothing of Jermyn Street about her appearance. At the same time, there she was, unmistakably the courtesan. I don't mean that she was rouged or dyed. I don't mean that she made advances to me. I don't mean that her conversation was anything but what any woman's might have been who found herself dining with a man completely strange to her. She was perfectly natural, and yet there was this extraordinary suggestion about her, that she was not just one of a type, but the type itself embodied in one person. Added to this was the impression I received directly she entered the room, that I had seen her before, again and again through dinner, stealing glances because I had a strong reluctance to show how interested I was. I tried to place her somewhere in my life. I failed so completely that for a time I gave it up. We just talked. About all sorts of things. It came to jewellery. She was wearing a big cabochon ruby in a ring. It was the only bit of jewellery she had. I admired it, and asked her where it came from. "I got that in Ceylon," said she. Suddenly my memory quickened. I held my tongue till we got into the sitting room. Then, while we were drinking coffee, I looked straight at her and said, "Did you know a man named Ganthony in Ceylon?" If I had expected any flutter of surprise, I was disappointed. Very serenely she looked at me and she said, "Are you trying to place me?" I admit for the moment I was disconcerted. I didn't know whether to apologize or frankly agree that I was. "My inquisitiveness is not as rude as it appears," I said. "I have a reason for asking." She inquired quite placidly what it was. For answer, I went straight across to my desk. Somewhere in one of the drawers was that snapshot Ganthony had sent me from Ceylon. I fished it out, satisfied myself first, and then brought it across to her. So far as a snapshot can be said to be a likeness in its minute dimensions and unposed effect, that picture of Ganthony's wife was the picture of the woman who was sitting there in my room. I'll swear to that. She took it from my hand. For quite a long while she sat there, looking at it, a slow smile spreading over her face as I watched her. At the sound of the doorbell of my flat, she looked up, straight at me. "Does this man named Ganthony come here?" she asked. Then it suddenly occurred to me. This was Ganthony. It couldn't be anyone else. And somehow she knew it. I hurried out of the room before Charles could open the door. It was Ganthony. Despite his ifs and buts, he'd come, and all this seemed part of the arrangement, part of some scheme of things which none of us could have prevented. I caught his arm as he passed through the door. "Are you prepared for a shock?" I said, as quietly as I could. I don't know why he should have looked distressed so quickly, but he did. "What is it?" he asked. I pointed to my sitting room door. "Your wife's in there," said I. "My wife's dead," he said, and there was a sharp note of anger in his voice. "I told you she was dead." I saw her dead, and thrusting my arm away before I could stop him, he strode to the door, opened it, and went in. For a moment I wondered whether I should follow. There's a sound principle about not interfering between a husband and wife. I was just about to go into the dining room when the sense of an odd silence got me. Well, there were no voices. I followed him. Ganthony was standing in the middle of the room, staring at the little photograph of her. There was no one else there. Without a word to him, I went to the little bedroom that opened off the sitting room. Her hat and coat were gone. I came back and walked across to the window. My flat is on the ground floor. I opened the window. There were no signs of her having gone that way, though certainly the snow was falling so fast that if there had been, her footsteps outside would have been covered by them. I turned back and looked at Ganthony. "I'll swear," I began. He just smiled at me, a thin sort of a smile, the smile of a man who has plumbed the depths of suffering and knows that nothing more can hurt him. "Don't bother," said he. "I've seen her myself. Nearly a year ago it was, at Monte Carlo. Last September I was in London, just for 3 days. I saw her then." "She's dead," he added. "I saw her dead. As dead as that sort of woman ever dies." Northanger passed his glass to Stennings to be replenished. All our minds were battling through the subsequent silence to ply him with our questions. It's no good asking me any more about it," said he. "That's all I know. And I don't pretend to understand." Today's story was Ganthony'S Wife by E. Temple Thurston. It was read by Jasper L'Estrange. Well, I do hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, sweet dreams.